It didn't help that Kathy had gone off to college, and William was headed into high school, aiming beyond it toward college. It dawned on me that as a parent, I really had the obligation to provide my children a home. And the final nail was an innocent question. Sorry, Kat.
It's all good. It's always my fault.
So, Mom, where am I coming home to this time?
I did ask that earlier.
Although God had clearly called me from the Steel Belt to the Midwest, from a small town in central Ohio to the southernmost shores of Florida, from America's playground near Disney, north into the deep south of Georgia, and then to the banks of the mighty Mississippi, from the rolling hills of southern Indiana to the bustling suburbs of Chicagoland, to the plains of a rural mid-eastern Illinois, surely God did not call my children to the same nomadic life without stability, without a place to call home. And again, like that heroine of the movie, Chocolat, I only came face to face with those realities through their frustration. And I know that to provide my children with a home means making conscious decisions. Still, the clever north wind is not satisfied. The wind speaks of towns yet to be visited, friends in need yet to be discovered, battles yet to be fought by someone else next time. And so it is that someday the north wind will grow weary and will be on its way. And when summer comes to our little village, a new breeze from the south will blow warm and soft. After generations of wandering in his own wilderness, their own wilderness, David's people had finally settled in their homeland. David himself, decades later, had been on his own long and difficult journey through a wilderness of economic and social shifts, pasture to palace, shepherd boy to prince, warrior to king of peace, and finally he had arrived, God in tow, all along. So finally settled in his home, literally a beautiful home made of the finest cedar of the land. It must have seemed downright disrespectful that the Ark of the Covenant, the presence of God, which had been carried for generation upon generation, reminding people of the central function and nature of God among the people, with the people, sat outside that beautiful palace in a crude tent. If David were afforded the luxury of sitting still, claiming a home, having one static place where people could find him, being safe and protected from whim and harm, if he were finally allowed to erect a monument to declare himself present to the world, then why not erect such a monument for God? Why not build a more permanent structure to house the glory of God, to hold it, to protect and defend the glory of God, to say to the world, this is where God dwells. Much to David's surprise and to ours too, as we construct great and beautiful palaces in which we anticipate God to dwell, holy places where people gather to devote themselves to God's service, holy places where people gather to offer sacrifices of time, talent, and treasure, holy places where people gather to sing praises and to pray out loud and to fall on their knees before the Lord, much to the surprise of all of us who have planted, at least in Owensboro, practically a palace for God on every street corner. God dares to say, no thank you. No thank you to our generosity. No thank you to that kind of devotion. God, it seems, prefers the gypsy life. God, it seems, prefers to be free and mobile and flexible and responsive instead of being bound up and boxed in and static and rigid and bureaucratic. Boy, did I say that out loud? God, it seems, doesn't mind being vulnerable to the weather out there in the tent. God doesn't mind being vulnerable to those who might try to wound or steal or even kill God. God, it seems, sees value to being available as much to the sinner outside as the saint within. God, it seems, sees value in living and dying unprotected to rise again in triumph. And instead of merely acquiescing and accepting our hospitality, God reverses the tables and would really rather take us and fashion us a house, a family, a legacy, a community of hospitality, shown love and grace and compassion. You see, as beautiful as this is, God does not need a building in order to look or feel important. God can do that just fine without one, as with one. I can't speak for other gluttonous gods who demand our constant attention, whining to be fed or to be reminded of how great they are. But our God is not needy. God instead urges us to respond to the needs of others. Our God does not need our constant care, but urges us to care for one another and others. Our God does not demand our piety, but instead commands that our piety be lived out in service to the least and the broken and the forgotten and the rejected. This building lovely, is not the temple. We are the temple. These bodies of ours, broken and too young and too old and too stiff and too painful and too loose, and oh my goodness, we are the temple that are built, are fashioned to bring the gospel to the world through the gifts God has given us. Do you remember that old child's finger play? Picked up a few years ago by the UCC as a broad marketing campaign. Here's the church. And here's the steeple. And you open the door and you see all the people. All the people. We bring back to God our first fruits of gratitude. Gratitude to God for bringing us to this place, to this moment, to this land, to this particular spot in God's grand universe, this new realization, this proverbial land which flows with milk and honey. Let's see, with sustenance and with sweetness. Can it be that this place flows with sustenance and sweetness? Abundant resources for living the faithful life. Not so that we can erect more statuary and more masonry and more structures that bind up God, restrict God in our efforts to protect God from others, but so that God might continue to use us in ever outreaching ways, ever widening the circle of God's grace until the whole world is not gathered in one specific walled-in, territorially marked space, or even a nation, but so that the whole creation is gathered in one spirit, in one attention, one focus to God. Although I think that God understands my need to provide a homeland for my children. Just as God understood the need of the Hebrew people to stop the wandering and finally come home. Just as God understood the gratitude of David for his beautiful cedar home and how it just didn't match up to what he was giving God. Just as God understood the need for our faith ancestors that worked to provide us with this beautiful spiritual home, I also know that any physical home is meaningless without an emotional heart of home.